So today, Pastor Peter Chin will share the message from John chapter 12, verses 1 through 11. I will read in Spanish, and Joshua will read in English. 6 días antes de la Pascua, llegó Jesús a Betania, donde vivía Lázaro, a quien Jesús había resucitado. Allí se dio una cena en honor de Jesús. Marta servía, y Lázaro era uno de los que estaban a la mesa con él. María tomó entonces como medio litro de nardo puro, que era un perfume muy caro, y lo derramó sobre los pies de Jesús, secándoselos luego con sus cabellos, y la casa se llenó de la fragancia del perfume.
6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Here, a dinner was given in Jesus' honor. Martha served, while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. Then Mary took about a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume. She poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume.
Judas Iscariote, que era uno de sus discípulos y que más tarde lo traicionaría, objetó: ¿Por qué no se vendía este perfume que vale muchísimo dinero para dárselo a los pobres? Dijo esto no porque se interesara por los pobres, sino porque era un ladrón. Y como tenía a su cargo la bolsa del dinero, acostumbraba a robarse lo que echaban en ella.
But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected. Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. He didn't say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief, a keeper of the money bag. He used to help himself to what was put into it.
Déjala en paz, respondió Jesús. Ella ha estado guardando este perfume para el día de mi sepultura. A los pobres siempre los tendrán con ustedes, pero a mí no siempre me tendrán.
Leave her alone, Jesus replied. It was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me.
Mientras tanto, muchos de los judíos se enteraron de que Jesús estaba allí y fueron a ver no solo a Jesús, sino también a Lázaro, a quien Jesús había resucitado. Entonces los jefes de los sacerdotes resolvieron matar también a Lázaro, pues por su causa muchos se apartaban de los judíos y creían en Jesús.
Meanwhile, a large crowd of Jews found out that Jesus was there and came, not only because of him, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. So the chief priests made plans to kill Lazarus as well. For on account of him, many of the Jews were going over to Jesus and believing in him.
This is the word of the Lord.
Today we're going to continue on in a sermon series that we're calling A God Who Grieves. And what we're doing with this sermon series is that we're looking at the moments in the Passion Week story, so the week leading up to Good Friday, where we see moments of grief and mourning. And it's an interesting way for us to explore those stories, to kind of look at Lent in a fresh new light and kind of through that lens. And so that's what we're doing. But not only is it a good way for us to look at Lent, it's also a good way to look at ourselves. Because grief, I think, is a very common emotion that we're wrestling with, but also something that's all around us. And so I think it's a good way for us to begin to prepare ourselves and begin for us to kind of see what grief looks like and what it looks like in the context of God's presence in our lives. So I think it's a very helpful practice for us to do that. Today's passage and message is going to be very practical in nature. It's not really about principles or theology. It's really talking more about how do we as believers engage with grief? It's more practical in that way. So you'll notice that I'm not going to talk so much about theology as I am about how do we prepare our hearts to engage with grief in our own lives, or else prepare ourselves to engage with the grief of other people as well. So more about how we live in this world rather than what we believe. And the way we're going to do that is by this passage, which was read this morning by the Gebhardts, which is when Jesus is anointed with oil in the book of John. And a few things that I wanted to point out about this passage, because it's a really important passage and there's a lot of different nooks and crannies to this. Number one, it's described in all four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And that might seem like a very ordinary thing, but actually it's quite common for things to be mentioned in one Gospel or two Gospels and three, but not in all four. And so it's actually not all that common for one story to be mentioned in all four of the Gospels. So that's one of the reasons why this story stands out. What's interesting about that is that even though it's mentioned in all four Gospels, all four accounts are slightly different from one another. So Matthew and Mark are very similar in how they talk about this moment, but John is a little different. And then Luke is very different in how he talks about this. There's differences in terms of where this takes place. There's differences in terms of who's present and who's doing what and saying what. And there's even a difference in terms of where Jesus is anointed. Some of these accounts say that his feet were anointed. Others say that his head was anointed instead. And so there's a lot of differentiation between the different accounts that you find here. And one interesting difference that you find in all of these accounts is the identity of the woman who's involved. In the book of John, it tells us that this woman is Mary of Bethany, who is the sister of Martha and Lazarus, and so good friends with Jesus throughout his entire ministry. But in the book of Luke, it identifies her as a sinful woman instead. But Mary of Bethany, from what we know, was not sinful in what we know, but very faithful to Jesus instead. And so people started to think, oh, the Mary from Luke is Mary Magdalene. But since the story is the same, many people started to think Mary Magdalene is Mary of Bethany. And in fact, there was a Roman Catholic pope whose entire ministry believed that Mary of Bethany was the same woman as Mary Magdalene. And I don't blame him, to be honest. It's kind of confusing in many ways. And so it's a really interesting passage that we could kind of spend probably an entire sermon series on just looking at this by itself. But what I want to do is I want to focus on one element of this passage. And there's a part that stands out to me the most, and it's the part that I think stands out to us as a church most as well. And I'll call it the elephant in the passage. And that's in verse 8, where Jesus himself says this: "You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me." I've never really liked that statement. I hope I like all the statements of Jesus, but this one has always been like, wait, what are you saying here? Are you saying that that the poor are not the most important thing to do, that there's some kind of devaluation or deprioritization of the poor here? And for us as a church, that I think we're trying to always lean into serving the poor as part of the Sermon on the Mount and throughout the scriptures, this kind of doesn't sit well with us. And then we pair this with what Judas says. Because Judas says something that I kind of resonate with. He says, why did she waste this? This is 70,000, 80,000, who knows how much equivalent today in terms of dollars, worth of perfume. This could have been sold and donated to feed the poor. Now, I don't know if it's just me, but part of me resonates with that. Part of me is like, yeah, he's got a point. He's got a point here with this. And so you put those two things together, and it kind of stops me from really engaging with this passage. Because at one moment, Jesus is saying, you're always going to have the poor. This is something different. And then the next moment, Judas has a point, and he says, this is a lot of money. This seems like a waste. And so I've always had a complex relationship with this passage. And so I want to help us kind of understand this. What is going on? How do we as a church that embrace justice try to live, to serve the poor? How do we understand these two statements? Well, John is very helpful in this regard because he includes Judas's real motivation in verse 8 or verse 6, where he says this: Judas did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. And so when we think about Judas's statement where he says, hey, this could have been sold for a year's wages and given to the poor, and many of us are like, yeah, that's a good point. We have to realize he wasn't a good faith actor. This was not a good faith question. He didn't care at all about the poor. He wouldn't have donated that money to the poor. All he cared about was money and trying to win a point against Jesus because he had this growing frustration with Jesus. That's his real motivation, and John's very clear in stating that so that we understand what that statement really was. It's not a statement about the poor. It's a statement about money instead. And in fact, there's a very interesting interpretation of this that comes from Vonnegut. Kurt Vonnegut, most of us know as an author who wrote Catch-22, but he was also a Christ follower. He liked to describe himself as a Christ-following agnostic, which I kind of like that description, actually. But he had this wonderful way of interpreting that statement where he said this: "For the poor always ye have with you," says everything about hypocrisy and nothing about the poor. It is a Christian joke, which allows Jesus to remain civil to Judas, but to chide him for his hypocrisy all the same. Judas, don't worry about it. There will still be plenty of poor people left long after I'm gone. My own translation does no violence to the words in the Bible. I have changed their order some, not merely to make them into the joke that situation calls for, but to harmonize them too with the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount suggests a mercifulness that can never waver or fade. I have a newfound respect for Kurt Vonnegut because this is not bad at all. What he's saying here is that when Jesus says, the poor you always will have with you, he's pointing out Judas and his hypocrisy. He's saying, Judas, don't worry. If you care about the poor, you will have the poor, knowing he cares nothing about the poor. And he says this because he knows Jesus' heart for the poor never fades as clearly as it's illustrated in the Sermon on the Mount. And so I think this is kind of helpful for us. But not only is it helpful for us to put Judas's words into perspective, I think it's also a point of learning and application for us as well right now. One thing that I think we can take away in our day-to-day mentality as we engage with culture around us is this: when someone says, "But what about?" when addressing something they have never cared about before, they probably don't care now either. What I mean by that, it's very common for us in all the debates, in all of the arguments that we hear intellectually or in the media around us, is that phrase, "But what about this? What about this situation? What about this plight? What about this suffering?" People might be talking about the situation in Ukraine and the terrible invasion there and the war and the children who are being killed, and they would say, "Yes, but what about children in Yemen? What about the starvation there and the ignorance of the West to what's going on there as well?" And we hear this in every single thing that ever happens all around us. But what about? But what about? And so this is a very common practice, it's a very common kind of rhetorical device that we use to bring attention to other things that might be going on. And so we often do that, right? We often use that kind of device to talk about things. But what I've noticed is that many times when I use that phrase, I'll use it in a way or to talk about a situation that I didn't really have any investment in before. I didn't really know anything about before. I've never spoken out about at all. And I'm simply using their pain and their situation and their state as a device or a way to prove a point to someone else. That's it. That's my only intention, is to win an argument. And I simply use someone else's pain to do that. It's exactly what Judas does. Judas cares nothing about the poor. He cares about winning an argument. And that's the only reason why he says, "But what about?" It's different if Judas has been on the side of the poor his entire life and he says, "But what about?" Then there's a legitimacy to what he does. But otherwise, this is not good faith, and this is not a good practice. I have a pet peeve about this that I've regularly spoken out about, and that is that in my story, my parents are immigrant store owners, and they've owned stores in the inner city, as have my in-laws as well. And so that's part of our story. And one unfortunate reality of having a store in the inner city is violence, especially during race riots. During race riots, when people are protesting racial injustice, oftentimes those people and those stores are the first to suffer. It's a hard story. But my father-in-law's store in LA was burned down to the ground to the LA riots. It's very personal. We know this story, and we know the pain that comes out of it. Every time that happens, when I look on the news, I will hear pundits and news experts and people in politics saying, "But what about those immigrant stores? What about their pain? What about their loss? What about everything they suffer in the midst of these protests?" And there's a temptation in me to say, "Yeah, they're taking my side. They've got my back in this discussion," until I recognize the point. I have never heard them talk about immigrants before. I've never heard them talk about immigrant rights or about the plight of immigrants. I've never seen them stand up in any kind of moment before. So in that moment, what they do is they take my father-in-law's pain or our story, and they want to employ it as a way to talk on a news program, as a way to make a point about something they don't like. And they use my family's pain to do that. And that's what they're doing. This is no different from what Judas did. It is a terrible thing to take someone else's pain that we care nothing about, that we have invested nothing into, and to use it simply as a way to make a point towards someone that we do not like. This is the attitude of Judas, and it's below us. It's below us as a people of Christ. And so as we engage with the world around us, as we engage in debates and all these painful things that are around us, yes, we want to make a point. Yes, we want to engage, but we should not use other people's pain as a way to win an argument. That is what Judas does. It is not what we should be doing as believers. That's just one thing that I think we can take away from this that helps us to engage with the world in which we find ourselves. But the other way that Jesus talks about this moment and explains the logic of this moment is where he says this. Judas says, hey, this is a waste. This money could have been used for something else, which we kind of find some resonance with. But then Jesus says this, leave her alone. Jesus replied, it was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. And so that's how he replies to this moment, right? Judas has this very logical thing. Wait, this is a waste of money. And Jesus says, this is a burial. What is he talking about? What does that have to do with the waste of money? I think what he's getting at is this simple principle. There is a totally different mentality and logic when it comes to dealing with issues of grief and mourning. It's a different world. There's a different perspective that you have to come when you talk about grief. Let me just give you an example. Let's say that you have a friend who has lost his wife. And so he buys a very nice grave plot or even a mausoleum so that he can go back and continue to be with his wife and celebrate his wife. And he has a magnificent dinner to invite all the friends and family who love this woman to remember and to celebrate together. And all these different things. It costs a lot of money if you know anything about those moments. And let's say after that dinner, you go up to that friend and you ask a logic question, an economics question, and you say to that friend, why did you spend all that money? Why would you spend all that money on that kind of coffin? You could have done something a lot cheaper. You didn't need this nice of a restaurant. I mean, we could have been good with anything. I don't know why you would spend so much money in that moment. How many of us would dare to do that? I hope none of us would. If you were going to, let me tell you, don't do that. It's not wise. Why don't we do that? Economically, it's feasible. It makes perfect logical sense. She's already gone. Why does the coffin matter? You could say all kinds of things in that matter, in that moment, in that context, but you never would. And you never would because you know that when someone's grieving, you don't use the same mathematics. It's not the same situation. And you never approach it with the same mentality and the same attitude and the same heart. You go up to that person, you say, I'm sorry for your loss. You don't ask questions about logic, mathematics, economics when a person is grieving. It is a different world and a different heart and a different reality when someone is in that moment. And that is what Jesus is pointing out. Judas is coming in this moment. He sees this from a logical point of view, as many of us would, because he fails to know where Jesus is coming or going ultimately, that in a few days he will be crucified. Because of that, he's dealing with this with a logic-based kind of perspective. He says, why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was a waste. This is a waste. This makes perfect sense from a logic perspective. But Jesus says, you don't get this. This is a burial. This is grief. This is mourning. This has nothing to do with money. This has nothing to do with the logic that you brought to this. This is about someone being buried instead. That's how he's explaining this moment for us. This is like when your friend has lost a loved one. You don't go asking questions about the money that was spent and the waste of that money. You go knowing this is grief. This is hugely important for us when we deal with grief in our lives or in the life of someone else. We can't come at it from the perspective of logic, economics, waste, timing, those kind of things. We have to come into it with a very different perspective, understanding this is grief. This is a different world than what we would have ever looked at online or debating with someone or balancing our checkbooks. This is not the same thing. I think not only is this helpful for us in terms of us kind of having a different perspective when we encounter grief, whether it's our lives or someone else's life. I think it's necessary also because this can really hurt us in our relationships with one another. One thing that we should recognize is that the failure to recognize the different logic behind grief can cause significant misunderstandings and further grief as well. Let's go back to that friend. And let's say that you did have the temerity, the terrible sensibilities to ask your friend at a memorial service, why are you blowing all this money? Why are you wasting all this money for this? She's already dead. She's already dead. Why are you doing this? I would guess that person would no longer be your friend. You're done. That would have to be a very gracious friend to say, oh, I thought she was very special. I would not take it hard if that person pretty much did not want to talk to you forever. You see what happens? If you don't understand grief and you don't enter into a grief on that person's terms, putting aside the logic, and you try to confront that person from a logic-based perspective, you will not be friends anymore. There will be a gulf that gets created between you. That's the reality. And that's precisely what we see in today's passage. Because what we read in this moment is this. At this precise moment, when Jesus says this, and he says, Judas, you don't get it. I'm going to the grave. She's preparing me for this moment. This is not logic. This is my burial she's dealing with. In Mark 14, it says this, then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray Jesus to them. They were delighted to hear this and promised to give him money. So he watched for an opportunity to hand him over. This is the moment that the Pharisees and Jesus decide this is it. They are not going back. There are many other moments they considered killing Jesus. They thought it was a good idea. They were afraid to do it. They're not afraid anymore. They're done at this moment because of this. It didn't happen with the miracles. It didn't even happen when he made whips and drove people out of the temple. It didn't even happen when he called them blind guides and called them terrible things in the woe to you passages. It happened here. Because they could not understand what was going on in this moment. Because they could not understand that Jesus was not being pompous. He wasn't saying, I'm worth it. Is that Revlon? Sorry, some commercial came into my head as I was saying that. Sorry, that really threw me off. That's my mind at this age, is remembering things from 30 years ago and not the thing that's right in front of me right now. But that's not what he's engaged with. That's not what he's thinking about in this moment. He can't understand this, and he thinks Jesus just doesn't get it. He's so pompous. He just wants attention for himself. Because he fails to understand Jesus, he's willing to betray him. You see what not understanding grief does. When we don't understand and we miss each other on these levels, and we completely miss what grief is versus logic is, your relationship with that person will never, ever be the same. And in fact, most of the Gospels recognize this at the moment that Judas and the Pharisees are going to turn. And they're going to finally be committed to killing Jesus. So that's another important point out of all of this. Not only is this an important way for us to engage grief, but if we don't engage grief in this way, and we don't engage the grief of other people in this way, there is a good chance that the relationships around us will fracture beyond our ability to repair. But here's the real kicker in all of this. We're all grieving. We're all grieving in some way. Maybe for some of us, it's a loss of a person, that kind of grief. For some of us, though, it's some grief from some other kind. We've lost normalcy. We've lost a relationship. We've lost a dream that we want in our lives. And therefore, all of us have grief of some level in our lives. And so all of this still applies. If we don't understand that, and we don't shift gears to one another, and we approach one another's grief from a logic perspective, a Judas perspective, saying, why are you talking about this? Why is this such a big deal? Why are you wasting your time thinking about this? This is nothing compared to what I'm going through. We are not going to be on good terms. We are going to fracture all around us with every single person that we meet if we fail to confront people on the grief that they're really feeling. And we need to recognize this. As we enter into a season where we are all grieving something, we will all have to make the shift from a logic perspective to a grief perspective. This is not just for those of us who know someone who is mourning right now. This is not just some of us who have lost a loved one. I think this is something for all of us as we enter into this next season of uncharted territory as a culture, as a society, as a church. The fact is, we don't wear it on our sleeves or a badge, but we're all grieving. Young people as well, you may not realize it, but you've lost something, and it's weighing on your soul. And if we don't recognize that, and we approach one another like Judas, a room full of Judases, a nation full of Judases, and saying, why is this such a big deal? Why are you wasting your time? Why do you call this suffering? Why are you grieving? We're not going to make it. We're not going to make it. We're going to turn on each other. And we're going to decide, that's it. I can't stand that person. I can't stand that group of people. I can't understand that part of nation. Can't understand anyone. And we're going to be very, very badly off afterwards. We all have to make this shift because we're all grieving to some regard. How do we do that, though? What does it look like for us to step away from the Judas perspective and enter into the Jesus perspective, this different logic, this different kind of mentality and voice and everything that we really need? Maybe just 3 things that kind of can help us take a step in that direction. Number 1, we need to stop telling others or ourselves, you should be over this already, or I should be over this already. That is one of the least valuable things you can ever tell someone who's grieving. Just get over it. Why are you still dealing with this? Number 1, it's not helpful. Number one, you're not helping that person by saying that if that's your intention. Number 2, it's not effective. I have yet to hear one person, because they were told by someone else, you should be over this already, they're like, oh, okay, I'm over it, thanks. I didn't know, and that's why I was holding on to this pain. But since you reminded me, I'm good, thanks. That's really helpful. It's just someone, see, someone got my joke, no one else did, but a young person did. It's really funny. It's not going to help. I guarantee it. I guarantee that never in the history of the world has ever someone told themselves or someone else, just get over it, and they get over it. It's not going to be good. But if that's not effective for grief when people are grieving, neither will be effective for us to do to one another or ourselves. In this season that we're entering, I think we need to really pull back on that statement. We need to really pull back on that judgment that we're placing on someone else to say, why are you still dealing with this? That's the small potatoes. You should just get over this. And we need to stop telling that to ourselves. No, some of you may not have lost a loved one. You haven't experienced COVID, or you've come out relatively unscathed, but you are grieving in some way. I've come out largely that way as well, and I'm thankful. I'm thankful, but I still am grieving many things that happened over the past year, absolutely. I don't think you should deny yourself that. I don't think you should say, well, I came out okay, so I shouldn't think about any of the things that I'm going through. I think it's okay to say, but I'm still sad. I'm still grieving. And so I think that's one thing, that just one practical step that helps us to enter into that grief mentality. Don't say, you should be over this by now. Don't say to yourself, I should be over this by now. That's not what we tell grieving people. Another practical way that we can do this, that we can go from less of trying to make a point and more of trying to make space. Again, when there is someone grieving, let me just give you advice as a pastor. Don't try to tell them what they should know. Don't try to tell them what they should feel. Don't go up to them and say, you should be thankful. Never start a conversation with a person who's grieving by saying, this is why I think this is good. This is why I think God's got you. I've learned through bad experiences, don't ever say that. Don't try to make a point. Don't try to bring up theology. Don't try to tell them what's right or what they should be thankful for. This is not a debate time. Grief is not a time for debates. It's not a time to make a point. It's not a time to prove how erudite you are, how much you know about theology. It's a time simply to be with that person. That is the best thing that you can ever do for a person who's grieving, is simply don't turn away from them. To make space, to no longer try to make points about their lives, but simply to make space. Again, as all of us enter into a season where grief is all around us, I think this is one helpful thing that we need to do. We shouldn't be making points about each other's lives. We shouldn't try to be scoring things. This is not the oppression Olympics. This is not a time for us to rate whether your suffering is worse than my own. This is not a time where we tell each other what's right and wrong. This is a time where we make space for one another instead. We need to shelve this kind of cultural imperative to make points and to drop truth bombs on each other and to drop mics. This is not the time for that. Grief is not a time where you drop mics. Come on. And if we're in a season of grief, we need to hold on to our mics. I guess that's the opposite. We can't drop them. This is not the time for that. Let's not make points. Let's try to win arguments here. That's not what this season is about. The last thing that I would say that maybe just practically would help us get out of the Judas mentality into a Jesus one is there to be less comparison between our situations and more compassion for them. So often, when we debate with one another about things that are going on, and we see this especially online, we compare what's going on. How can you compare what's going on here to what's going on here? How can you compare what's going on in your life to what's going on in my life? Very much to what Judas is saying here. How can she do this when there is this? That we look at things from this logic, debating, ideological standpoint of comparison. Let me compare you to me, or this person to that person, this plight to this plight, and that is how we approach these situations. Again, when someone's grieving, don't do that. It's not helpful. Of course we know that, right? We all know that when someone has lost someone, you don't go up to that person and say, hey, at least you didn't lose 2 people, because wouldn't that have been worse? No. We all know that, right? We know that by instinct. No, I'm not going to compare things. So neither should we do that now. We're all grieving, so don't compare. We should never do this. We find a powerful example of someone resisting this from Scripture with the parable of the Good Samaritan. In the parable of the Good Samaritan that Jesus talks about in Luke chapter 10, there is a man, a Jewish man, who was beaten and broken down on the side of the road and robbed and left for dead. And in that process, 2 Jewish men pass him by, not wanting to get involved, not wanting to be unclean, not knowing what is going on, and they just go by. But then a Samaritan comes. To us, a Samaritan means very little. We think it's someone from northern Israel, from Samaria. What that means is a blood enemy of that Jew. Samaritans and Jews killed each other. They would go into their holiest sites and defile them, raze them to the ground. That's what a Samaritan is. We're talking about the worst possible enemies. This Samaritan sees this Jewish man broken on the side of the road, and he sees them, and what he does not say is this: what do I care? What about the suffering of my people? What about how you came to Mount Gerizim and how you defiled my place of worship? What do I care about you? I think about my own suffering. My suffering and my people's suffering is so much worse. In that moment, what he says instead, but an enemy, a blood enemy, as he traveled, came where the man was. And when he saw him, he took pity on him. He didn't compare and say, my suffering's worse than yours. What about my people? I don't care about your people. He took pity on him. And I hate that word pity. It's a very faulty translation, because pity for us is, I feel badly. That word in the Greek means guts. It comes from the word intestines. He felt it here about this man's brokenness. And because of that, he binds his wounds by himself. He puts him on his own donkey, and he pays for that man's convalescence with his own dime. This is the mentality that we have when we see suffering, not to say, but what about? What about me? What about this group? But to simply be moved to the core by what we see. There's another story that I think captures this so well and so powerfully. And it's a story that I've told before about Elie Wiesel. Elie Wiesel was a survivor of the Holocaust, possibly the most nightmarish moment in all human history, and the author of Night. And one time he was speaking at an event publicly about his experiences at a concentration camp surrounded by death that not even movies could portray accurately. And in the midst of that moment when he was speaking, a Palestinian youth stood up and began to interrupt his speech, saying, "But what about the occupation of Palestine and the suffering of the Palestinian people and the death of Palestinian youth, including my friends? What about these people?" And Elie Wiesel stopped and he approached this young man. And he could have done many things in that moment, and he could have compared. He could have said, "How dare you? Do you know what the Holocaust was? Do you know what I saw? How dare you compare that to me and to what I have gone through?" And he could have probably owned that day. He could have dropped the mic on that young man. But instead, what Elie Wiesel did, he began to weep. And he hugged this Palestinian youth, and he said something that I've never stopped thinking about. He said, "Don't compare. Don't compare. All suffering is intolerable." He refused to draw a line between what he had seen in the concentration camps to what this boy had seen in Palestine. To him, it was all suffering. His suffering was his own suffering. It wasn't a separate suffering, it was human suffering. So he embraced this boy as his own. His pain was his own. This is what we as Christians should be doing in this next season. Our calling in this season is not to engage with the grief that's around us in the way the world does, by taking sides and saying, "Yeah, but this is better than this, and you should know this. This is a debating point you didn't know." We come at this like the Good Samaritan. We come at this like we read from Elie Wiesel, saying all suffering is intolerable. The dying of people in Yemen, the starvation of young children, that is intolerable. And so is the death of children in Ukraine. These are not separate things to us. We're not going to play a game here. We're going to grieve. And when we grieve, we embrace both of those things at once. This is our calling, not to be like Judas. And as we enter into this new season where we begin to mingle, and we mingle with grief all around us, we are not Judas people. We are Jesus people. We are Good Samaritan people. We don't have to compare. We are here to grieve with people. Let it be known to this world who we are by the fact we're willing to grieve with them. We won't call them out. We won't compare. We won't say things are worse or better. We'll simply understand what they're going through, and we'll be there with them. If the worship team wants to come up at this time, please do so. But we're also just going to take a moment to do that. This is a big shift. This is a big shift for us to go from what we're hearing from the world and the paradigm the world has put in front of us, and instead to enter in this next season as Jesus does. The world is living out Judas. Let's now commit ourselves to Jesus. We're entering into Passion Week. We are entering into the Good Friday of our nation. As we do that, there is temptation to be like Judas, to be like media, to be like politicians, to approach this time as a time to win, a time to compare, a time to judge. Let's not do that. On Good Friday, we come to listen. We come to grieve. We come to make space. Let's commit to this as a people of God. Dear God, we confess we are surrounded by influences from this world. So much of the media and the politicians and everything around us are telling us that the mentality of Judas is fine and great. Call it out. Drop the mic. Compare. Show that you know everything and that someone is wrong. But we know, just intrinsically know, that when someone is grieving, you never do that. It's wrong to do that. We are entering into a season of grief. And as we do that, God, help us to make that transition, to step away from Judas, to step away from the way that he thought about things, and to instead have a grief mentality, as if we are grieving all around us with the people who are around us. To look at people and not to see people we need to win against, but to see people who have lost. Small things, large things, but we have all lost. And may the world see your love through that. May the world know we are your followers by the way we grieve with and for one another, because grief is love. Help us to do this by the power of your Holy Spirit. In the name of Jesus, amen.